what I wanted to do is just reflect a little bit on my perspective on this initiative, both, as Paul says, from a position as Chief Executive of the largest umbrella organisation in England, and also having a foot also in the European Economic and Social Committee, and having had the opportunity to contribute to, I think, now 3 opinions relating broadly to this area. And I was particularly pleased that colleagues put this in 2 statements that I think are quite important. Firstly, I think this is a window of opportunity. It's a window of opportunity, I think, to open up a complete third part of financing and entrepreneurial development within the broad, within civil society, particularly focusing on enterprise. So I welcome that. And secondly, from colleagues in the European Commission, that this is seen as part of the growth strategy, because I think that is very critical. You know, we're all used now to austerity, although I have to keep reminding people that this is year 1.5 of 7 or 9, depending on how you calculate it. But actually, there is clearly an austerity strategy. Clearly, that is important. But we need also, and I think our government recognises that, I think the European Union recognises that, a growth strategy. Let me start with sort of social entrepreneurship. I'm not going to focus too much on this because a lot has already been said. Just 2 observations in relation to social entrepreneurship in the European Union. The first is that it means different things depending on who you're talking to. And if you think there's inertia sometimes in the UK development, you should spend some time in Brussels. It's institutionalised inertia in some places. And let me explain what I mean by that. One of the dangers in trying to drive this initiative and the social entrepreneurship development is that it may well be captured by, I think, more traditional parts of the social economy. By that I mean the big battalions of the trade unions, the co-ops and the mutuals, who think that they own this agenda. But social enterprise is understood more in the north of Europe, and in particularly in the United Kingdom and the Nordic countries. You see more of it understood there. It's interesting that it's been the UK and Sweden, to a certain extent Denmark, and the Baltics to a certain extent, who've sort of grasped this agenda. In the south of Europe, you still have very traditional views in relation to the social economy, where you do find the big battalions in terms of co-ops and mutuals, who will, I think, try and absorb this agenda if we are not careful. Let me move on to the second topic, which is the whole area of social investment. Social investment, I think, does hold real potential to develop a third family strand. And I want to pay tribute to Nick's commitment to this area. As he rightly says, this is not a partisan issue. This initiative started under the previous government, but I think has been given a serious boost up by this government, particularly in the way in which it's created big society capital, which I think is the right approach. It's the right approach because previous government attempts here have been to create new retail banks, if you like, and often have flooded the market with cheap money and have distorted the market, I think, in a way that hasn't been helpful. This is an opportunity to develop a strategic approach, a wholesale approach, with this new institution working with existing retailers. I think there are 2 issues in relation to social investment. I don't think, actually, interestingly, it is an enormous absence of capital. I think there is quite a lot of capital. I think it's, again, fairly, and this I sort of talk a little bit about the sector. The sector is not always its own best friend in relation to this agenda, because it tends to be relatively conservative in the way that it thinks about its financing. It does sort of radical things, but it finances them in a rather conservative way. And I think it is really investment readiness, which is still a key block to actually growing this market. People becoming ready to do this, willing to do this, willing to take a little more risk, and also risk failure. The other problem, I think, in this market is language. And this is therefore, and it's double in the European Union, because you have the problem in actually translating what you mean by things. And I believe you me, if you ever work on opinions in the European Economic and Social Committee with God knows how many different translations, and you see these documents and people begin squabbling about what the words mean. And if you add social investment into that mix, you will find quite a lot of squabbling about what the words mean, not only because there's cultural differences and linguistic differences, but also because social investors talk a completely different language, which is not always easy for people to understand. This was brought home to me. We did a early breakfast round table some time ago now, when Ronnie Cohen was beginning to develop his ideas, and we hosted a breakfast to bring some of these people together. And I chaired it, and after about 10 minutes I had to say, look, I'm sorry, I do not understand what you are talking about. Deal flow was a new sort of idea to me. I thought this was something to do with playing poker, but apparently it isn't. But interesting, there was a woman from Barclays Retail there. She brought it home to me. She said, okay, you have to sell these products in a way that actually appeals to citizens. And she said, where do you live? And I said, I live in Greenwich. She said, right, okay. She said, if there was a Greenwich ISA, which paid slightly less than the market return, but was actually putting that into working capital to fund projects in Greenwich, would you have that rather than the ISA that you've got? And I said, yes, I would. She said, well, there you are, you see, you've just contributed to a social investment opportunity, but it was called a Greenwich ISA. So I think the language that people use is critically important. We've just done a guide called Social Investment Made Simple. You get it off our website. And it's getting a lot of downloads, I'll tell you that. The European initiatives in these areas are very, very welcome. They are relatively small, and I think what the EU needs to think about is whether these initiatives can leverage in finance or elsewhere. That seems to me to be fairly critical. The other dimension, seems to me, is the extent to which the European Social Fund, we now play a big part, because we took over and merged with the Third Sector European Network, which is now called the European Funding Network. So we give a lot of advice about European funding. And it's important the way in which the ESF funds can be used as leverage in this play. They are about dealing with the most disadvantaged. They are often engaged in employment programs. They can be very helpful, and I think they could be leveraged. But it's important that it doesn't just completely become a social investment fund, because what people need operating in this area is almost blended funding. You can't suddenly say, there's a sort of almost quasi-religious debate that goes on, you're either for grants or for contracts, or now for loans or against loans. Of course, what people need is blended finance. Some will be able to use social investment, some will require grants, working in the most difficult areas, and some it's appropriate to have contracts. But you do need a blended funding environment, and that's what I'd like to see the ESF beginning to move towards. Finally, rules. Nothing will work in this field unless the procurement rules are reasonable and proportionate. What drives out activity from the third sector is when they are not proportionate. So we're particularly pleased, we've done a lot of work on this as well. And we're particularly pleased to see raising the threshold for EU procurement rules. That's going to be critically important. We're trying to shift the expectation towards smaller contracts and requiring more explanation around larger contracts. And we want to provide greater clarification as to how procurement rules are actually applied in practice by local authorities. So, just in closing then, I think this agenda represents something crucially important. As Nick says, it is an opportunity. It's a moment in time where there seems to be some alignment between what we're trying to achieve here in terms of, if you like, building a third aspect to the sector, and what the European Union is trying to do, both in terms of its social initiatives, but also in terms of its growth agenda. And I think putting it in the context of the Single Market Act is actually a stroke of genius, if you don't mind me saying so, because because you are aligning it to an agenda which we in the UK, part of the EU agenda that we in the UK definitely sign up to. We're not so sure about social solidarity, but we are sure about the single market. So I think that was excellent. I hope that's helpful as a sort of tour around what's going on in relation to this initiative.